Hello, I'm Toby Haydock, and although I have lost my faith in our traditions, I keep my faith in you. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme about accepting that sometimes the smallest victories are almost the most important. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time, or you know your Richard Rodney Bennetts from your Rodney Bennetts, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, Carol Ann Ford returns, but as far as the viewer is concerned, it's as if she has never been away. So join me, Toby Haydock, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Day of Darkness, or It Was the Sun God What Won It. First broadcast on the 13th of June 1964 at 5:15 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman. It was written by John Lucarotti, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Crockett. It was watched by 7.4 million people, and the audience appreciation was 58. As the tunnel that leads from the Garden of Peace begins to fill with water, Ian discovers a concealed passageway that leads up into Yetaxa's tomb. He rigs an ornamental belt to provide leverage to open the tomb door from the other side. However, he underestimates the effort required, so the Doctor starts working on a pulley, a device unknown to the Aztecs, to facilitate their escape. But Totoxel, Tanila and Ixta conspire to frame Ian for an attack on Ortlock, shattering the faith of the High Priest of Knowledge and leaving only Kameka sympathetic towards the Time Travellers. Now both Susan and Ian will be punished on the day of the solar eclipse, and Totoxel plots to murder Barbara while the land is covered in darkness. The when. February 1915. The Gaumont Film Company opens a new studio facility at Lime Grove in Shepherd's Bush, London. It undergoes a major redevelopment in 1932 and is purchased by the Rank Organisation in 1941 before being acquired by the BBC in 1949. This is intended to be a short-term arrangement until the completion of BBC Television Centre in 1960. Lime Grove will end up being used slightly past this date, finally closing its doors a mere 31 years later in 1991. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. 27th of July, 1933. The Triumph Film Company announces that it has purchased a Victorian-era iron foundry on the north bank of the River Thames in Hammersmith. Triumph will convert the premises into a new production facility, which becomes known as Riverside Studios. It changes hands several times over the next 2 decades and is purchased by the BBC in 1954. This is intended to be a short-term arrangement whilst renovations to the studios at Lime Grove are underway. Riverside will wind up being used slightly past this date, finally closing its doors a mere 20 years later in 1974. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. 21st of May, 1950. Having been retrofitted for television productions, the facility formerly known as Gaumont Studios reopens as Lime Grove Studios. Originally allocated to BBC children's programming, Studio D becomes the principal home of the BBC's drama productions in 1952. 4th of June, 1956. Like Lime Grove, Riverside Studios has required significant renovation to transform it from a film studio to a television studio. Riverside Studio 2 becomes operational on this day, to be followed by Studio 1 on the 25th of September. 29th of June 1960. Having been under construction for a decade, the studios at BBC Television Centre in White City begin a phased opening. Studio 3, the first studio in use on the site, takes over as the primary drama facility in 1961, although BBC Drama continues to make heavy use of Lime Grove Studio D as well. 19th of March, 1963. Preliminary planning is underway for the Saturday tea time serial that, in the months that follow, will become Doctor Who. At this stage, it is already intended to be made in Lime Grove Studio D. 28th of May, 1963. Rex Tucker, who is serving as Doctor Who's interim producer, writes to head of drama Sidney Newman to voice his concerns about the allocation of a technologically ambitious project like Doctor Who to the antiquated Studio D. 31st of May 1963. Tucker's memo is the subject of a meeting between Donald Wilson, the head of drama serials, Aiton Whittaker, drama group administrator, and Ian Atkins, the controller of programme services for television, who has the ultimate authority over studio bookings. Atkins agrees with Tucker's comments. Both the lighting gallery in Studio D and the cameras, which have no zoom functionality, are unsuited to Doctor Who. But what are the other options? There are now 4 studios open at Television Centre, but, unsurprisingly, there is substantial demand for their use. Studio 4 is not a feasible candidate because it's principally reserved for comedies in the same way that Studio 3 is the province of dramas. Studios 2 and 5 are much smaller facilities. Whilst Studios 3 and 4 are both about 590 square metres, Studios 2 and 5 are barely 1/3 the size, at 220 square metres each. Now, in theory, both could be booked simultaneously for Doctor Who, but they're also at opposite ends of the building, so recording breaks would have to be carefully scheduled to give cast and crew enough time to traipse from one studio to the other. The possibility of recording in either Studio 2 or 5 across 2 days is also discussed, although this would entail much higher fees for the cast. Another option is Riverside Studio 2, but it's awaiting an upgrade of its effects equipment, an enhancement which has neither been budgeted for nor approved. As a result, Riverside Studio D currently doesn't offer the use of inlay, a crucial visual effect at this point in time, which Doctor Who likely won't be able to do without. The meeting concludes with Wilson requesting that Doctor Who's first serial be assigned to either Studio 3 or Studio 4 at Television Centre, followed by a move to Riverside Studio 2 if the inlay equipment has been installed in time. 7th of June, 1963. At Sidney Newman's behest, John Mayer, the senior planning assistant for television, agrees to speak to Ian Atkins about the possibility of technological upgrades to Lime Grove Studio D. 12th of June, 1963. John Mayer and Ian Atkins revisit the notion of Doctor Who being made at Riverside Studio 2. It's suggested that the inlay equipment currently housed at Television Centre Studio 2 should be moved to Riverside Studio 2, therefore expediting the time frame in which Riverside Studio 2 would be able to accommodate Doctor Who. 13th of June 1963. Donald Baverstock, the chief of programmes, nixes any move of inlay equipment from Television Centre Studio 2 to Riverside Studio 2 because it's needed for the comedy series That Was the Week That Was. Baverstock gives instructions that Doctor Who's first 8 episodes should be assigned to Lime Grove Studio D, with a move to Riverside Studio 2 to be considered once the impact of Lime Grove's outdated resources becomes clear. 18th of June 1963. In a memo to his boss, Assistant Controller, open brackets planning, close brackets, Joanna Spicer, John Mayer boils down the options for Doctor Who's studio space to just 2. Either it will have to be made in Lime Grove for the foreseeable future, with Riverside Studio 2 a possibility but not a guarantee down the line, or the programme's production will have to be delayed by at least 6 weeks while the BBC makes a decision about upgrades to Riverside Studio 2. Mayer himself prefers the latter choice, although it's now been observed that productions already scheduled for Riverside Studio 2 will complicate matters, since there will have to be some reallocation of facilities to provide an opportunity for the inlay equipment to be installed. 21st of June, 1963. It's decided that unless the inlay equipment can be sourced from another BBC studio, an option Donald Baverstock has effectively already vetoed, then the upgrades to Riverside Studio 2 can't happen until 1964. By the 25th of June, it becomes clear that the earliest date that Riverside Studio 2 would be ready for use is July 1964, owing in part to the need for uninterrupted access to studio facilities in the run-up to the April launch of BBC 2. 15th of July 1963. Word has reached Ayton Whitaker that Lime Grove Studio D is going to be taken out of commission during December. He asks John Mayer what this will mean for Doctor Who's studio allocation, starting with its 9th episode, at this point the opening instalment of Marco Polo. By the 18th of July, there's some suggestion that Doctor Who might move to Riverside Studio 1, but over the next 5 days, it becomes clear that Whitaker is mistaken and Studio D is to remain operational at least into 1965. It has now been identified as the only studio available to Doctor Who for its 9th episode and beyond. 8th of August 1963. For some time, the Doctor Who production team has been planning a story in which the Doctor and his companions are shrunk to tiny size, but it is now felt that Lime Grove Studio D is not up to the challenge. Story editor David Whitaker writes to Ayton Whitaker, "I am very loath to abandon the idea of a minuscule adventure for Doctor Who without asking you what chances there are of eventual transfer from D to a studio capable of handling the visual effects which are, after all, an integral part of this project." 12th of August 1963. Echoing David Whitaker's concern, Donald Wilson asks Sidney Newman for support in lobbying to have Doctor Who move to better studio facilities for the proposed minuscule story. Of the serials to be made at Lime Grove, he writes, "I can assure you the programmes will be good, though in TC3, TC4 or Riverside 1 they would be even better." Wilson is worried that Doctor Who will seem lazy or timid if no effort is made to provide it with the full range of modern television technology. He seems to be under the impression that Newman is satisfied with Lime Grove Studio D, but the head of drama responds the very next day to say, "You've got me the wrong man," and to assure Wilson that "I'll do the best I can" to secure an appropriate studio for the minuscule story. It does not appear that he makes any headway, however, and the minuscule's idea will eventually be pushed down the production schedule. 7th of November, 1963. During a meeting of the serials department, the possibility is raised that Doctor Who might remain at Lime Grove but shift from Studio D to the more technologically sophisticated Studio G. Studio G offers the benefit of being larger than Studio D, but at the expense of extremely awkward dimensions, roughly 3 times longer than it is wide. The length of Studio D, by contrast, is only about 1 1/3 times its width. As such, productions in Studio G require careful planning to ensure that the geometry of the sets suits the available floor space. 5th of December 1963. Doctor Who producer Verity Lambert complains to Ian Atkins about the limitations of the cameras in Studio D. Of the 4 cameras normally in use, only 2 have ring-steering pedestals, which are installed in April. A third was scheduled to arrive in July, but it appears not to have been implemented. This means that 2 of the cameras are still lumbered with old-fashioned mounts, which are heavy and have very limited vertical motion. Lambert asks for 2 additional ring pedestals to be supplied. 16th of December 1963. A preliminary list of forthcoming drama productions notes that 13 episodes of Doctor Who will be made in Riverside Studio 1, starting with the 3rd episode of Story 5, which will eventually be The Keys of Marinus. But that's not what happens. 7th of January 1964. Terence Cook, the acting drama organiser for television, tells Donald Wilson that Doctor Who is to be moved to Lime Grove Studio D, starting with the 5th episode of Story 5. "Does this fill you with delight or horror?" Cook wonders. 10th of January 1964. More concrete studio allocations are made for the 2nd quarter of the BBC's 1964 production schedule. Will Doctor Who move to Riverside Studio 1, as suggested on the 16th of December? To Lime Grove Studio G, as Terence Cook believed on the 7th of January? No. In a classic case of anticlimax, it will instead stay put in Lime Grove Studio D, at least partly at the insistence of Joanna Spicer. 20th of January 1964. Donald Wilson complains to Terence Cook about the news that Doctor Who is to remain in Studio D. He points out that both Doctor Who and the Sunday Classic serial, which shares the same facilities, are continually encountering technical issues during recording. He is also very concerned about the impact of heat on Doctor Who during the summer month. Studio D is located on the 4th floor of the building, so it becomes positively sweltering as the mercury starts to rise. Wilson reiterates these points to John Mayer in a memo of the 6th of February. 1st of March 1964. The minuscule story is now scheduled to be made towards the end of Doctor Who's production calendar, and a request has been submitted for it to be recorded in Television Centre, Studio 1, which is due to open on the 15th of April. 17th of March 1964. Peter Wigsell, the assistant head of scenic servicing, is the latest to raise concerns about Doctor Who's studio assignment. The previous Friday, the 13th of March, saw the studio fireman hold up the start of recording on Assassin at Peking, the concluding episode of Marco Polo, because he found that some of the sets extended into the fire lanes at the periphery of the studio floor. Wigsell notes that this has regrettably become a regular practice in Studio D, but that the problem is exacerbated by the size of the sets employed in Doctor Who. To make matters worse, there's nowhere at Lime Grove to store unused studio lights, and so they're often left blocking the fire lanes. "The studio last Friday was a veritable death trap," he writes. "If the present state of affairs is allowed to continue, we run a serious risk of losing an episode." Wigsell believes that Doctor Who needs to move to a studio where the lighting rigs are motor-driven as opposed to being manually lifted on chains, as in Studio D. Associate producer Mervyn Pinfield offers similar commentary the next day. 14th of April, 1964. Now, wait a minute. You didn't think I'd forgotten about the making of the Aztecs, did you? The first scene to be filmed for its final episode, The Day of Darkness, is completed on this day at Ealing Studios. It's the climactic fight between Ian and Ixter, with stuntman David Anderson, who's playing the Aztec captain, and Billy Cornelius, filling in for William Russell and Ian Cullen, respectively. 29th of April, 1964. Conversations about Doctor Who's studio assignment have been ongoing throughout the early part of the year, and today something finally comes of it when The Warriors of Death, the second episode of The Aztecs, is reallocated to Television Centre, Studio 3. But what's brought about this change of fortune? 30th of April, 1964. A long memo from John Mayer to Joanna Spicer lays out the course of recent events. The planning department has had several motivations to deal with the Doctor Who studio situation, with Peter Wigsell and Mervyn Pinfield's concerned about the blocked fire lanes and heat in the summer, amplified by pressure from the trades unions about working conditions in Lime Grove Studio D. Mayer was first able to get Doctor Who 6 weeks in Television Centre Studio 4 in late summer, which will include the production of the minuscule story. Furthermore, he has now won Donald Wilson's agreement to move Doctor Who into Lime Grove Studio G for the 4 preceding weeks. In fact, the programme could have occupied Studio G even sooner, but Verity Lambert has rejected an earlier move because of the extent to which mostly or fully completed scripts would have to be revised to suit Studio G's unusual dimensions. As a compromise, the planning department will try to accommodate Doctor Who in Television Centre Studio 3 or Studio 4 wherever possible, but on the condition that an episode may have to shift back to Lime Grove Studio D with as little as 4 weeks' notice. And this is how The Warriors of Death has come to be reassigned to TC3. Now, there remains the longer-term issue of Studio D being due for a major overhaul in March 1965. Mayer can see no alternative but to permanently relocate Doctor Who to Studio G at that stage, but he suggests that the problem be revisited at the end of the summer. 8th of May 1964. Joanna Spicer replies to John Mayer's memo, indicating that both she and Donald Baverstock are sceptical that there is sufficient justification for Doctor Who to move out of Lime Grove on a long-term basis. Apart from the minuscule story, she feels that its most suitable home going forward is Studio G. Spicer's letter implies that the 6 weeks Doctor Who has been promised in TC4 will be truncated to just 4, but Mayor's office reassures the Doctor Who production team on the 11th of May that they will live up to their promise. 13th of May, 1964. In a memo to Donald Wilson, Verity Lambert rails against the decision to move Doctor Who to Lime Grove Studio G on an ongoing basis because of the limitations that its layout will impose.
Although it might be possible to cut down our requirements slightly on serials involving the future, it would be absolutely impossible to do so in the past serials, since we are trying to present an authentic picture of how various civilizations appeared.
But Lambert is no happier with the possibility of Doctor Who staying in Studio G.
We have struggled along for 6 months in this studio and have made compromises of all kinds. The sound equipment is inadequate, old-fashioned and worn out. The cameras do not take any wide-angle lenses or any zooms. The lighting equipment makes life almost impossible for any lighting supervisor and, because of the heat, unbearable for everybody else in the studio.
17th of May, 1964. Carol Ann Ford flies back from her holiday, so while she may have missed recording of some of the Aztecs, she will be able to see it all. She has, however, missed the last 2 episodes of The Keys of Marinus, although her conscience is probably clear as she tells the reporters waiting upon her return that she, her daughter Miranda, and husband Walter, described by the papers as an impresario, have
spent the last 14 days having a glorious family holiday. Now I'm all set for more work on the Doctor Who series for television.
18th of May, 1964. With the studio drama hanging over the production team, it's time to rehearse the historical drama that's about to go before the cameras. The venue, as usual, is the Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road, and Carol Ann Ford rejoins her castmates following that 2-week holiday. But things do not go smoothly due to an incident of small-mindedness, as it's described in a memo 2 days later by John Crockett's production assistant, Ron Craddock. Writing to Barry Bull, the BBC employee responsible for allocating rehearsal rooms, Craddock explains, "We arrived soon after 10 a.m. to find the rehearsal room closed. After much unnecessary fuss, we got in. Well, after 10:30 a.m., no thanks to the caretaker. This gentleman had been told that we would be rehearsing on this day, Whit Monday. For the want of a piece of paper stating this, he kept us locked out. At this rehearsal room, one doesn't get the cooperation one really would like, but I believe you've had this tale about this rehearsal room before." Shortly after receiving the memo, Bull rings the production office to say that the Army has called to apologise for the incident. 20th of May, 1964. Sidney Newman writes to Donald Baverstock about the future of Doctor Who, including its studio allocation. We'll discuss the rest of Newman's memo in a Too Much Information to come, but as far as the studio facilities are concerned, he rejects Studio G out of hand because of its dimensions, and also notes that Studio D has now been deemed unsuitable for drama productions. Newman also asks that Doctor Who be moved to either Riverside Studio 1 or to Television Centre. "Unless the proper studio can be allocated for Doctor Who from week 38, he writes, referring to the recording of the Dalek Invasion of Earth, Episode 1, "I think it would be better that I recommend its cancellation. I can't bear to see this potentially marvellous programme go down the drain through inadequate support." In the event, Doctor Who's relocation to Riverside Studio 1, as of the Dalek Invasion of Earth, is finally settled by the end of June. 21st of May, 1964. Carol Ann Ford helps to raise £800 for disabled children by attending a fete in Ilford held by the Goodmayes Round Table and, to use the parlance of the time, the Ilford, Romford and District Spastics Association. She is later than intended held up by rehearsals for the Day of Darkness, but when she finally gets there, she made a tremendous impression on the crowds present, says the Ilford Pictorial. She was kept busy judging competitors and signing autographs. 21st Century Comic-Con attendees will be reassured to know that there were charges for Doctor Who star autographs even in 1964. albeit for a now politically incorrectly named charity, with Ms Ford's setting fans back sixpence a time. That's about 64p in today's money. Modern stars take note. After all that, the newspaper reports that Ford's only moment of relaxation came when she sat down to watch the evening's wrestling. Blue Peter stars Christopher Trace and Valerie Singleton had been guests earlier in the day. They brought a gollywog to auction off, as if to emphasise that the past really is another country, and even when they were doing nice things with good intentions, they were still doing things we probably wouldn't do today. 22nd of May, 1964. And if you've been wondering where all this studio talk is heading, well, it's heading to today, because as far as the recording of The Day of Darkness is concerned, it's back to Lime Grove Studio D after 2 glorious weeks at Television Centre. And, as if to welcome back the cast and crew, or perhaps to vent its frustration at being passed over for a newer model, the studio promptly discharges its sprinkler system during camera rehearsals. It probably doesn't help that this is the hottest day of the year so far, with the temperature peaking at 30.6 degrees. Arrangements have been made for the components of the TARDIS set, 2 wall flats and the control console, to be stored in Lime Grove's entrance area during the day. This is because the set will not be constructed until after most of the episode has already been recorded, taking the place of another set, so that maximum use can be made of the available studio space. The recording session runs from 8:30 to 10:15 p.m, a half hour longer than usual, to accommodate the need to remount the closing credits for The Bride of Sacrifice, which had been found to be incorrectly formatted the previous week. 13th of June, 1964. The transmission of The Day of Darkness draws the Aztecs to a close, starting at 5:15 p.m. as scheduled. Coincidentally, this is now the hottest day of 1964, with the high in London reaching 31.1 degrees, almost 8 degrees warmer than when The Bride of Sacrifice aired a week ago. The summery weather probably helps to deter some of the extra 500,000 viewers who tuned in for episode 3. The Day of Darkness is seen by 7.4 million people, the same figure as the first 2 parts of The Aztecs. Similarly, its placement at 34th in the weekly chart is equal to that of episode 2, The Warriors of Death, but 15 places lower than The Bride of Sacrifice. A small consolation is that the audience appreciation figure nudges upwards by a point to 58%. 22nd of June 1964. A clip from The Aztecs, featuring Ian Cullen as Ixta, is broadcast as part of the BBC's Points of View feedback programme at 10:15 p.m. 17th of August 1967. Clearance is given for the master tapes of The Aztecs, including The Day of Darkness, to be wiped. Fortunately, BBC Enterprises hold on to 16mm film prints, and then, in January 1985, The Day of Darkness, along with episodes 1 and 3 of The Aztecs, is returned from Cyprus. The Day of Darkness also survives as an Arabic dubbed print made for Morocco in November 1967. This does not feature Richard Rodney Bennett's score, however, but rather an alternative set of musical tracks. 2nd of November 1992. The Aztecs is released on VHS video by the BBC. The Day of Darkness undergoes 2 cuts for this edition. As usual at the time, for a Hartnell story, the next episode caption has been removed, and there's also a minor excision due to some damage to the print. October 2002. The Day of Darkness is released on DVD with the cuts to The Day of Darkness restored. A special edition follows in March 2013. The DVD versions, as well as picture tidying and restoration, contain some jiggery-pokery to hide the fact that some of the shots in the fight sequence show the edge of the set, especially with the bigger picture space, bigger than what would have been seen on broadcast, afforded by the new medium. The What? Unlike in the earlier episodes of The Aztecs, the reprise at the start of The Day of Darkness is a telerecording of the closing seconds of The Bride of Sacrifice. This decision has no doubt been influenced by the fact that much of this footage already consists of filmed inserts, and so it's simpler just to replay the material rather than reenact it. After the title and writer captions, there's a bit of a narrative leap on screen. We just saw Ian looking around in desperation as the water started to fill the tunnel, and now he's found the marked stone in the ceiling, which will lead him to freedom. John Lucarotti seems to have intended the start of this scene to bridge the two moments, suggesting that the shot would start with Ian playing his torch over the walls and roof. Some neat camera trickery follows. The first shot of Ian was captured on camera 4. After the fade to black, William Russell is now on the floor, crawling towards camera 1, which has been fitted with a periscope attachment, giving the illusion that he's climbing upwards. Following the second fade to black, Russell is back on his feet, and camera 4 is panning downwards to give him the illusion of ascent. Out in the temple garden, William Hartnell ad-libs the Doctor's repeated demands that Ixter reopen the tunnel. There then follows a recording break, which allows both William Russell and camera 1, now without the periscope attachment, to reposition themselves on the tomb set. This is essentially the same set that we saw 3 weeks ago in the Temple of Evil, but the knob to which Ian attaches the webbing he finds near Yatux's remains is a new addition. After Barbara calls out to Ian, she has more dialogue in the script.
Thank heavens it's you. I thought...
She seems to be delivering some version of this on screen, but she's drowned out by the grams of the tomb door closing. Ian and Barbara's subsequent exchange differs between page and performance. As written, Ian shows Barbara the rope leading under the tomb door, which prompts Barbara's question about whether he came through the tomb, and Ian's explanation about the tunnel in response. The first piece of business is dropped on recording, with Ian's explanation now inspiring Barbara's question. Following the Doctor's appearance, several changes are made to Ian's dialogue that add warmth to the character. When he emerges from behind the throne, he is written to simply address the Doctor by name, instead of giving the reassurance that, "I'm all right." When the Doctor asks how the rope works, the on-the-nose scripted response is, "A counterbalance," whereas William Russell provides the more jocular, "Don't worry, I've got it licked." Barbara's reference to Susan being heavily guarded is another deviation from the script, where she simply says that Susan is bound to be guarded. Ian's scripted reaction is, "I'll find her, you wait here." The recorded line is, "Don't worry, I'll get her out. Now you stay here." Ian returning the Doctor's torch and the Doctor thanking him is another ad-lib. After Susan refuses to believe that Ian is dead, Ixter is scripted to say, "The old man was there when he died." Ian Cullen instead delivers, "The old man saw him die," which is either a slip of the tongue or an attempt to bolster Ixter's bravado with some artful embellishment of the truth. Another example of Ian's dialogue being refined comes in his response to Susan's statement that Ixter claimed he was dead. "He nearly told the truth," is the awkward phrasing in the script, but "I nearly was" is the version that we hear on screen. The very end of the scene in which Ian rescues Susan was dropped in rehearsals. As written, Ian crosses to the shelves at the back of the barracks. He picks up his bundle of clothes. Then he asks Susan, "How was school?" To which she cheekily responds,
Not much better than yours in England.
The following sequence at the temple archway is meant to begin when dawn is streaking in the sky, although the use of a painted backcloth makes this unfeasible. William Hartnell skips the line, "The seminary's outside the town," which is supposed to explain why he thinks it will take Ian some time to return. Presumably this was dropped because Ian didn't rescue Susan from the seminary, but from the barracks. It's not explained how he knew where Susan would be, but we can imagine that he may have simply spotted the guards escorting her to Ixter and followed them. Alternatively, in John Lucarotti's novelisation, he gives Ian a sudden realisation that Ixter would prefer to hold Susan in the familiar confines of his quarters. Barbara's statement that the Aztecs didn't know about the wheel is consistent with the popular belief in 1964, but it's no longer deemed to be accurate. Instead, scholars now think that it's the practical implications of the wheel that had escaped the Aztecs, the Incas, and the Mayans. In fact, they did use wheels in toys and ornaments, but whereas the denizens of Eurasia were driven to develop the wheel as a tool to use in conjunction with beasts of burden like horses, cows, and oxen, no comparable animals existed in South America. The hilly topography of the continent probably further discouraged the development of wheeled vehicles and therefore impeded any wider exploration of the wheel's other uses. There's a great Hartnellism during the Doctor's reunion with Susan. "My dear child, "I can't tell you how glad I am to see you," is what John Lucarotti wrote. William Hartnell instead gives us, "My dear Susan, I'll tell you how glad I am to see you later on." When the time travellers are trying to open the door of the tomb, it's meant to be Ian who proposes running the rope over the top of the throne. After it snaps, a stage direction indicates that Susan looks aghast at the broken end in her hand. Instead, Carol Ann Ford leans forlornly against the throne. A speech of the Doctor's is missing after Ian and Susan leave the temple for the Garden of Peace. Before Barbara's comment about drowning people, he was written to say, "I'm sure this is sensible, my dear, but in case it doesn't work, I have another idea." This omission coincides with a very abrupt jump between the wider shot on camera 3 and the two-shot of the Doctor and Barbara on camera 2. William Hartnell is suddenly considerably closer to Jacqueline Hill, for instance. In his The Fact of Fiction article for Doctor Who magazine, Alan Barnes argues that this is the result of a rare videotape edit rather than material that was dropped prior to recording, and he wonders if it may have been due to a technical fault. Prior to Susan's discovery of the unconscious Ortlock, Ian is scripted to spend more time working at the stone which leads to the tunnel. Ian tries the stone. It is wedged indeed. Ian gets his fingers into a likely spot and strains at the stone. It moves slightly. He relaxes. He tries again. The stone gives again slightly. Only then does Susan call him over. When Kameka suggests to the Doctor that they postpone their wedding, John Lucarotti writes, "Doctor Who nods his head. He is deeply touched." William Hartnell muddles his response to Kameka's offer to intercede with Ortlock. He is supposed to say, "It's the Toxel we must contend with," but Hartnell accidentally inserts a negative, so the statement becomes, "It isn't just the Toxel that we have to contend with." Fortunately, this statement still retains its sense, given that the Doctor then offers an observation about Totoxel and his kind. The Doctor patting Kameka's hands at the end of this sequence is a late addition to the camera script. The staging at the start of the next scene differs from the script. "Barbara is standing above the throne," says a stage direction. Ortlock, stiff, formal and suspicious, stands in front of her. Instead, John Crockett has added the guards to the action, having them part to reveal the two characters, with Ortlock initially positioned behind Barbara. When Barbara asks Ortlock to thank Kameka for encouraging him to speak with her, the script indicates that the High Priest of Knowledge should bow, but this gesture is absent from Keith Pyatt's performance. We've noted in earlier instalments of Too Much Information that the Aztecs plays out over a much longer time frame than the on-screen action explicitly suggests. Another strong indication comes in the conversation between the Doctor and Kameka about the almost completed wheel.
"I've always known it would take you from me,"
she says, which implies that the Doctor has been carving it for a considerable length of time. The first part of this scene is written to take place with both the Doctor and Kameka sitting on the bench. Before the Doctor's apology, he takes her hand and holds it. He's scripted to rise as Kameka declares the Aztecs
a doomed people.
At this, Doctor Who remains silent for a moment or two. She looks at him, and he at her. Kameka then stands as the Doctor tells her that she will always be dear to him. Kameka's departure from the Doctor is also written slightly differently. "She hurries away," writes John Lucarotti, whereas on screen Margot Vanderburg adopts a slow, melancholy gait. Then the Doctor sits there quietly with the wheel in his hand. He turns it over once, goes back to work on it. When Ortlock addresses Kameka, she brushes away the tears from her eyes. At the start of the scene in the barracks, André Boulet forgets that the perfect victim is supposed to thank Tanila for his many courtesies, so he grasps for the word gratitudes instead. Ixta's instruction about bringing Ian and Susan to the sacrifice is addressed to a guard, who is scripted to bow in response. However, John Crockett has framed the shot so that the guards are no longer in vision. The Doctor's speech before Totoxel arrives in the temple is longer in the script. "I shall only need a moment to open the door to the tomb," he says. "We can all slip through and be inside the TARDIS before they realise what's happening." During the subsequent exchange between Barbara and Totoxel, the camera script proposes a three-shot with the Doctor still visible in the background, hiding behind the throne. fiddling with the pulley. On the day, however, Crockett has settled for a two-shot featuring only Barbara and Totoxel, so we don't get the scripted ending of the scene in which the Doctor emerges from his hiding place. The man tasked with watching Ian and Susan is referred to only as guard in the script, but Crockett has assigned the role to David Anderson, who is again credited as Aztec captain. When Kameka shows him Ortlok's ornament, a stage direction notes that his eyes glisten. Kameka's interrupted statement to Ian and Susan that
"It is important"
is an ad-lib by Margot van der Berg. The staging of the sequence in which Ian knocks the guard unconscious plays out a little differently from the camera script. Here, the guard re-enters the barracks, crosses to put headdress on table, and turns. Ian stands. When Kameka insists that the guard let Susan leave with her, the guard wavers, then shakes his head. On screen, however, he paces, apparently considering the request, and then turns back to say something to Kameka before Ian delivers his clubbing blow. Perhaps this has been altered because there is no obvious reason for the guard to remove his headdress. In the script, Ian's quip about making up the guard's mind for him comes after Kameka has placed Ortlok's ornament on the unconscious man. She rises and looks at Ian reproachfully. Ian, patting Susan's shoulder and encouraging her to go with Kameka, replaces a simple nod of the head in the corresponding stage direction. The business of Ian bending down and removing the guard's headpiece is not in the script, where he instead just picks it up from where the guard left it on the table. The headpiece fits William Russell very well because it is, in fact, the same one he wore earlier in the Aztecs. The camera script notes the possibility that a recording break might follow this scene to set up the pulley for the story's climax and to give William Russell the opportunity to don his eagle headdress. We don't know if John Crockett actually stopped the tape at this point or not. Another small ad-lib occurs at the start of the next temple scene, with the Doctor responding to Susan's inquiry regarding Barbara's whereabouts that she's in there, namely the anteroom. When Ixter kills the Aztec captain, the script gives no indication that he's coming round, as seen in David Anderson's on-screen performance. He's just described as the unconscious guard. After Totoxel attacks Barbara, there is a brief shot of Ixter as he hears the High Priest of Sacrifice shout his name. This is staged to look like it takes place at the foot of the temple steps, but Ixter is actually on the set for the Garden of Peace. The combat between Ian and Ixter was pre-filmed at Ealing. There are no accompanying stage directions in the surviving camera script. Note that part of Ian's costume comes away when he's struck by Ixter. This may be stage combat, folks, but that doesn't mean there isn't the potential to make real contact and cause real injury. And it's one reason why Doctor Who has been lucky to have employed so many talented stunt artists and fight arrangers over the years. The studio recording resumes with Ian Cullen standing against a canvas flat, painted to look like the foot of the temple steps. Camera 2's output has been flipped upside down to help sell the illusion that we're looking down on Ixter's prone form. The comments that Ian and the Doctor make as the tomb door opens are ad-libbed by William Russell and William Hartnell. The eclipse is achieved by mixing between two photographs, one of the sun in total eclipse and one depicting it beginning to emerge from behind the moon. Unfortunately, these appear to have been placed in the wrong sequence because the moon should move from right to left, or more precisely, east to west, across the face of the sun. Stage directions at the start of the next scene note that the light on top of the TARDIS is working, although it's never visible in shot. We're also told that the TARDIS door is open and that the Doctor is dismantling the pulley, neither of which are reflected in the episode as transmitted. A final recording break occurs after this scene, giving the cast an opportunity to change out of their Aztec costumes and the crew time to put the TARDIS set in position, since there was no room for it earlier in the evening. The fade to black which follows the shot of the Doctor at the controls is just meant to indicate the passage of time. Recording wasn't interrupted. When Ian enters the console room, a stage direction says that the Doctor leans on the control room, looking worried. William Hartnell adopts his familiar lapel-gripping pose instead. He also skips the first part of his scripted response to Ian, I'm glad you've bathed and changed, Chesterton. Some of the subsequent dialogue has been reassigned between the Doctor and Susan. As written, the Doctor's reply to Barbara's question is, "My instruments. They say we're stationary." The latter part is instead given to Susan, although she uses stopped instead of the more fuddy-duddy stationary. This replaces her scripted line,
"Oh, have we arrived, Grandfather?"
Presumably it was realised that Susan wouldn't have to ask such a question, since it's already been established that she's well versed in the TARDIS controls. When Barbara speculates that they may have landed inside something, the Doctor's is ad-libbed by William Hartnell. A stage direction indicates that they all look at her, but the tight shot chosen by John Crockett means that we'll have to wait until the next episode to find out how her fellow travellers will react. The Who. Marcus Dods. Marcus Dods, the conductor of Richard Rodney Bennett's score for the Aztecs, enjoys his only Doctor Who credit on this serial. He was born in Edinburgh in 1918, the son of Professor Marcus Dods and his wife Madge, née Potter. Young Marcus was educated at rugby school before winning a choral scholarship to King's College, Cambridge. He then attended the Royal Academy of Music. He studied before World War II at the Royal Academy, but that stint was interrupted by the outbreak of the conflict, and he served in the RAF as a bomber pilot of distinction, rising to the rank of squadron leader. For his conduct during his service, he was awarded the DFC. He resumed his studies in 1945. The same year, he married Marna Wheelhouse, and in 1947 became assistant music director to the rank organisations Muir Matheson, working on productions like Laurence Olivier's 1948 Hamlet. Between 1951 and 1958, he was chorus master and conductor at Sadler's Wells Opera. In 1966, he became chief conductor to the BBC Concert Orchestra, where he struck up a friendship with the oboist Deirdre Lind, 21 years his junior, whom he married in 1969, after splitting from Marna, who went on herself to become a successful dog breeder. In 1972, Marcus became head of the London Concert Orchestra and was still conducting with them as late as January 1984, when they presented an evening of Tchaikovsky, and March that year, when it was an evening of Rodgers and Hammerstein at the Festival Hall. He reunited with Richard Rodney Bennett on the 1974 film Murder on the Orient Express, and his other film scores as conductor included John Schlesinger's Far from the Madding Crowd, 1967, Nicholas and Alexandra, 1971, Death on the Nile, 1978, The Life of Brian, 1979, The Great Muppet Caper, 1981, in which he can be spotted on screen as a restaurant conductor, and The Dark Crystal, 1982. He was also musical supervisor on 1964's The Gorgon and the famously bright-eyed 1978 animation of Watership Down. On the small screen, Marcus Dods composed the music for all 26 episodes of the seminal BBC version of The Forsyte Saga, 1967, and conducted the title music for The Pallisers in 1974. His many other TV credits included The First Churchills, 1969, Pollyanna, 1973, The Mallons, 1979, David Attenborough's Life on Earth, 1979, the BBC Shakespeare series productions of A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1981, and Cymbeline, 1982, and the epic miniseries The Last Days of Pompeii, 1984. That year, Dods enjoyed one more collaboration with Richard Rodney Bennett, when he conducted a presentation of his frequent colleague's work on February the 24th at the Barbican. Dodds' son, also Marcus, observes of his father's working relationship with Richard Rodney Bennett that, they would have had a complete understanding. I mean, they worked together a lot, and they must have had a very good understanding of what to do. My dad was known primarily as a conductor, but he did a lot of arranging, so that probably came into play in what they were doing there, I should think, and Richard would have known and would have entrusted my dad to have quality control, if you like, over what they were doing in the studio, for sure. Marcus Dods was due to be conducting the English Sinfonietta at some concerts in April 1984, but had to withdraw when he became seriously ill with a recurrent condition and was replaced by Neville Dykes. Marcus never recovered from his illness and died on the 30th of that month at the age of 66. He was survived by Deirdre and his 4 children, the youngest of whom was only 9 years old when his father passed away, and recalls, "I remember him as a big chap. He was a big, friendly, well-built sort of dad. He was busy in those years that I was alive, but everybody always says he was very much a very kind person who was very generous with his time and was always out to help everybody. And everybody in the music industry has always told me what a great conductor he was to work for. I worked at the Royal Academy of Music for 18 years, and many of the professors there worked for him when they were younger in their careers. And they always told me that he was such a nice man to work for, because he was, if you like, he was a bit more like one of them. There can be a sort of dividing gap between the conductor and the layman, if you like, the other musicians, but he wasn't like that. He wanted to be part of everything, and he was a very warm and generous man, and a good, exciting, fun person to work with." Although primarily known for his conducting, Dods did compose a piece that has endured. It was written for Deirdre and is called Highland Fancy. John France, on his website British Classical Music, describes it thus: "The piece is one of gentle melancholy. There are some romantic moments that paint a lovely picture of distant hills and mountains seen in the gloaming. It's very much a Scotsman's view of his native land, viewed from afar." Being written for Deirdre, the piece also, of course, heavily features the oboe. Deirdre died in June 2021, nearly 40 years after her husband, but the music lives on. Jill, Marcus's daughter from his first marriage, studied at the Royal College of Music before going on to work in the wardrobe department on a number of movies, including The Rocky Horror Show and Bugsy Malone. Of his 3 children with Deirdre, Kirsty, the eldest, is a keen amateur musician playing flute and piano and singing. Alison is a violinist who performs contemporary and classical music regularly as a member of the Tippett Quartet. She is also a member of the acclaimed theatre ensemble The Gogmagogs and has performed with bands such as Ocean Colour Scene and Paul Weller, on whose album Heavy Soul she appears as a solo violinist. And his youngest child, Marcus, works as a piano tuner for the piano company Steinway & Sons. And thanks to Marcus for his generosity and help with compiling this short biography of his father. John Crockett. Having directed the middle episode of Marco Polo in order to give Waris Hussein some breathing space during his journey to Cathay, John Crockett returned to Doctor Who to direct a full story, The Aztecs, whereafter he was heard from no more in the Whoniverse. His name never appeared on the credits of Doctor Who again, nor was he ever interviewed by any publication about his work on the show. So it behoves us to use this edition to give him proper consideration. John Angus Basil Crockett was born on the 31st of January 1918 in Hampshire, the second and youngest son of Colonel Basil Crockett and his wife Jessie, née Thompson. He studied at the Bryanston School, public school in Dorset, before studying art and theatre design at Goldsmiths College in London. He also studied theatre design at the Slade School and attended the London Theatre Studio. He then became involved in Little Missenden Abbey, a school for problem children in Buckinghamshire, his classes encouraging them to paint freely, but with no formal teaching. With his family background, he had been destined for the army, but he rebelled against this, going so far as to declare himself a communist and to use his paintings to characterise political figures. A man of strong convictions who would rage against perceived injustices in the world, including his own upbringing, he was a tall man, 6'4", and possessed of great energy. He joined the Adelphi Theatre Company that had been founded by his friend Richard Ward, but really wanted to create his own. He was too strong a character. Interested in music and dance increasing their visibility in productions, he toyed with starting a dance company, and as a result, he met Anne Stern, daughter of the eminent physicist William Stern OBE, who was a dancer at the Margaret Barr Dance Drama Group. It was love at first sight for John, and he and Anne married in 1940. In 1944, Crockett and his wife established the Compass Theatre. He borrowed £150 from a rector friend in order to fund the start-up, and proudly paid back the sum 5 years later, and bought a van in order to tour the country doing new plays by modern writers. Their first play was by W. W. Gibson, the poet known to Doctor Who fans as the writer of The Ballad of Flannan Isle, so memorably deployed in Horror of Fang Rock, and their second by Crockett's friend R. H. Ward, which was an attack on capitalism and rich landowners. Actor Leslie Hardy recalled of John Crockett that, "For the Compass players, he was a dominant figure. He was the founder, man of ideas who generated the artistic energy. He had injured his back and had a patent welding job done by an eminent surgeon. Therefore, John couldn't do much lifting and carrying. He always had a sketchbook at hand. People, places, equipment, beds were all recorded. Although believing in democracy in the form of company meetings about policy and finance, John was basically an autocrat. Finances were tight, and I can remember we had to state what luxuries we could hardly do without. John insisted on suits made by his West End tailor. The director had to present a good appearance, and only that tailor could make the proper pockets. John had to have his packet of 20 gold flake a day and his tin of Mick McQuaid tobacco. Plus his annual subscription to the London Library had to be maintained." But whatever his contradictions, John's aims for the Compass Theatre were heartfelt, and it was a success. This ramshackle group of creatives took their work all around the country, visiting towns and villages where there was no live theatre, and putting on quality plays in all types of buildings, no matter what the conditions. They were a cooperative. The actors mucked in with prop-making, stage management and van maintenance. The Compass players influenced a great many of the people who worked for them, and can definitely claim to have had an impact on theatre in education in Great Britain. But all good things come to an end, and after 8 years, the Compass players disbanded. Company manager Maurice Daniels recalled that John Crockett was an extraordinary maverick from a traditional English upper-class background, endowed with more creative talents than it is fair for one person to possess. His artistic values were uncompromising, their integrity unimpeachable, and these were reflected in all his theatre work as a director. He was both demanding and encouraging, with an acutely suspicious eye and ear for the spurious in acting. We learned from him respect for the text, and perhaps more important than anything else, how to listen on stage. After the Compass Theatre breakup, John returned to painting, but directed at Scunthorpe Civic Theatre and ran summer classes. In 1960, Crockett did a stint at Birmingham Rep, but he'd begun his journey onto television prior to this, having produced and directed James Brassabon's play People of Nowhere, about a family displaced by World War II and a resultant murder in a disused church-cum-refugee camp. Commissioned by the Dominicans of Hawksyard Priory, no less, as a contribution towards World Refugee Year, the play had been staged in the round at a real church at Crockett's insistence in 1959. In 1961, the piece's, and with it Crockett's, reputation was such that it was greenlit for television, with Crockett once again choosing to stage the action in a real church. In 1962, Crockett and Brassabon's Icon Theatre Company took over the Lyric Hammersmith for 6 months. The core cast included John Woodvine, Glenda Jackson, Patrick Godfrey, Christopher Burgess, and the Aztecs' John Ringham. Crockett both directed and designed plays in this season, but, according to Ringham, the rest of the cast were openly contemptuous of him because he had no idea how professional actors worked. He was happiest with amateurs, I think. After an episode of Compact in March 1965, his 18th, he turned his back on television directing and indeed the BBC after discovering that he didn't really fit in with the London media set. "Oh, he never fitted," recalled John Ringham. "At the BBC he was looked upon as a joke." Ian Cullen remembered that there was a schism between theatre people like Crockett and the television technicians. Stuntman and arranger Derek Ware felt that Crockett had the air of someone who thought themselves too good for the medium and didn't understand how to work within it. And work within it he did not, after the 1960s. In 1969, in fact, he joined the staff at Downside School in Somerset, teaching art and drama there until 1976. He and Anne then retired to Cornwall, and he spent his final years devoting himself to his painting and his Catholicism. Devoutly religious, he and Anne became oblates of Princash Abbey in Cornwall, dedicating themselves to the service of God. John Crockett died peacefully in October 1986 after an illness at the age of 68. "He had more effect on my life than anybody else bar none," remembered John Ringham later. "That man had enormous talents in many, many areas. He could dance, he could paint, he directed, he acted. He wasn't a very good actor. I always felt he was a man born outside his century. But he was a wonderful man with a heart the size of a mountain, an intensely clever man, very good mind." According to Maurice Daniels, John was a dynamo of creative energy and human contradictions, patient and of an infuriating intolerance, high, ebullient good humour and a lower flashpoint than most people have. But his occasional moods of gloomy depression were outbalanced by an excoriating sense of humour and a zest for life that was delightfully infectious. He was never dull to be with. John was survived by his 8 children, who include a daughter Mary, who is an artist, and a son Anthony, who is a British general practitioner, hospital practitioner, and medical writer who is an expert in asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. Every Doctor Who story so far has had something to recommend it, whether it's the sheer novelty of an unearthly child, the wild inventiveness of the Daleks, the nightmarish surrealism of The Edge of Destruction, the epic scope of Marco Polo, or the high-spirit adventurousness of the Keys of Marinus. But it's here, at the conclusion of The Aztecs, that we start to recognise the amazing scope that will come to define Doctor Who for the next 60 years, and counting. Sure, there's plenty here to entertain the younger set. Tlatoxel is a ranting, full-blooded baddie, and Ian gets to engage in dramatic combat with Ixta at the top of a ziggurat. John Lucarotti even slips in an educational lesson about the Aztecs' lack of awareness of the uses of the wheel. But the Day of Darkness offers so much more than that, so much that appeals to virtually any viewer, regardless of age. This is a fundamentally bittersweet episode. A Day of Darkness, indeed. Perhaps that was unavoidable, given the setting and the subject matter. Indeed, it's basically set up right from the Doctor's memorable line in Episode 1, forbidding Barbara from rewriting history. But now we see that idea made manifest. Barbara doesn't change history, and human sacrifice does continue. And the Aztec civilization will be all but wiped from the face of the earth. Yet that doesn't mean that the TARDIS crew have accomplished nothing. The notion that Barbara has still managed to earn a victory of sorts through the salvation of Ortlock is nuanced and sophisticated, but compelling enough that any child watching could still appreciate it. However, it's the relationship between the Doctor and Kameka that's the beating heart of the Day of Darkness. Margot van der Burg gives a wonderfully noble performance, gradually acknowledging that the future she has envisioned with her love will never come to pass, and discarding any inclination to wallow in her sorrow. In fact, her departing, "think of me," is tender but not without a hint of recrimination. She's no patsy, and whilst accepting her fate, she doesn't spare us from seeing the damage it does to her. This is real love, folks. If the Doctor's happiness means that he has to leave her behind, then that's what Kameka is determined to bring about. Her own desires take a firm back seat. The Doctor knows it too. His final moments in the tomb, discarding and retrieving the brooch she had given him, communicate this plainly. It might not be up there in the same league as the first 10 minutes of Pixar's Up, but for what was designed to be a disposable episode of 1960s Saturday tea-time telly, The Day of Darkness paints a remarkable romance with lyrical economy. And in the end, the baddies win. Yes, we have a spoonful of sugar as Ian helps Ixta go down a few floors at record speed, but his boss, Tlatoxel, remains unscathed and gleefully brandishes his knife at the end, continuing with the practice Barbara was so keen to stop. Again, this is a sophisticated moment because Tlatoxel is ignorant of what we know, that his victory will result in an even greater amount of Aztec blood spilt upon the arrival of Hernan Cortes, and that everything Tlatoxel holds so dear will be swept away in the violence that he has always practiced. Blood will have blood. Character, thoughtfulness, philosophy. These are definitely the enduring strengths of a story that has the sense to throw in plenty of action, Ian fighting the Flood and then his nemesis Ixta, which is decently staged window dressing, but nothing compared to the serious intentions of the writer and committed performances of the cast, who even 60-odd years later stand as totems to the Reithian ideals at the heart of the conception of Doctor Who. We wouldn't change this historical. Not one line. Oh, and you failed to save a civilization, but at least you helped one man. Doctor Who, The Day of Darkness, featured Keith Pyatt as Ortlock, John Ringham as Tlatoxel, Ian Cullen as Ixta, Margot van der Burr as Kameka, Walter Randall as Tonila, Andre Boulay as Perfect Victim, and David Anderson as Aztec Captain. The title music was by Ron Grainer at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, the incidental music by Richard Rodney Bennett, the conductor, Marcus Dods, the story editor was David Whittaker, the designer, Barry Newbury, and the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, it's the first Doctor Who episode to be set entirely on a spaceship that doesn't also travel in time. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, Strangers in Space. Or, in space, no one can hear you because you're walking slowly and gently around a set that isn't very big. Too Much Information, The Day of Darkness, was presented by me, Toby Haydock, from a script I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone, with special thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, and Graham Kimball-White, and extra special thanks to Marcus Dods. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music for Too Much Information has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, called Far Too Much Information, which is for now exclusive to patrons, who also qualify for bonus material, early releases and other exclusives, as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also 6 months ahead with my Happy Times and Places podcast, so if you want to hear me do battle with Big Finish and Private Eye writer Nev Fountain on Gallifrey for The Invasion of Time, or with American radio host Ken Patterson for The Invasion. That's it, just The Invasion. It's Invasion Time and The Invasion of Time, for now only on Patreon. So head to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information were it not for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that have been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those intrepid high priests of knowledge who were responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of The Aztecs, written by Matthew Kilburn, are a treasure trove of insight and information. John Ringham and Ian Cullen remember John Crockett on the excellent documentary Remembering the Aztecs on that DVD, and I also spoke to the late Ian Cullen for my Who's Round podcast. Much of the other information about John Crockett herein came from Plays Without Theatres, compiled and edited by Pamela Della, published in 1989 by Highgate Productions Beverley Limited. Newly available from Telos Publishing is Doctor Who, The Production Diary, Volume 1, The Hartnell Years, by David Brunt, the deepest dive ever undertaken into the surviving documentation that depicts the making of Doctor Who. This goldmine of day-to-day details will let you feel as though you're sitting in the office in 1964, peering over the shoulders of Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. The Doctor Who production diary is the latest addition to a small library of splendid reference works that chronicle the earliest days of Doctor Who. They span Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who the early years, to the Titanic team of Doctor Who the 60s and Doctor Who the Handbook The First Doctor by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, to the indispensable Doctor Who The Complete History, Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History, which is a whole series co-edited by Mark Wright, boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson and Alistair McGowan, and, of course, builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for the Aztecs can be found in issue 266, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Alan Barnes studied the Aztecs in issue 516. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of the premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 29 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of the Aztecs, although this one is more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. A great resource of information about British television studios can be found at tvstudiohistory.co.uk. It's maintained by Martin Kempton, who worked for the BBC in both the camera and lighting departments and later as a freelancer, albeit never, alas, on Doctor Who. I walk in the shadows of giants who know a lot about the studios of yesteryear because it makes up for the fact that they could never hope to fit inside one. My thanks to the patrons who make these podcasts possible. They include Stephen Moffat, Peter Burns, James Corey-Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Richard Straw, Neil Tetch, Nick Tedston, Harry Palmer, Michael Page, Josh Bernard, Steve Appleman, Alex Tilbury, Colin Varney Earworm, Daniel Mybus, John McClay, Steve Jenner, Andy Priestner, Robert Davis, Luke Ashby, Derek Carville, James Brindley, Daniel Brennan, Nick Delisle, John Turner, that's John without an H, Gareth Heald, Daniel Smith, Tom, Luke, Martin Kennar, Stuart Milne, the Tom Tit Foundation, Liam Pennington, Howard Chadwick, Joey Stephen, David Spofford, Chris Stokes, Adam Stone, Mark Swan, Matthew Tate, Dr. Gary Thomas, Richard Thomas, Jason Thompson, Sabrina Tirabassi, David Trainier, Sidney Trowett, Jim Trenowden, Fanman Sang, John Turner, John with an H this time, Lee Wakeley, Gary Wales, Jeff Walker, Steve Walker, Alistair Wallace, Craig Wallace, Gavin Ware, Peter Ware, Stephen Waters, Kevin West, Rich Wiggins, David James Wilson, Chris Williams, Mr. Withett, Stephen Witkowski, Lee Wood, David Workman, Alan W. Wright and Mark Wright.